Hey guys, welcome to your next lesson on animal adaptations to their environment. In previous lessons, we've talked a lot about variations in climate. We've talked about different levels of precipitation, temperatures, variation in light in terms of seasons and day length, and essentially how much light gets to the forest floor or gets deep into the ocean. And so we talked a lot about environmental variation. In the last lesson, we learned about plants and how plants have evolved to succeed in different types of climates and different environmental conditions. And today we're going to focus on animal adaptations. Essentially, an animal living in an environment must have many different adaptations that help it to succeed under these particular circumstances. And so we're just going to focus on a handful of them today. We could go into a lot of detail about any one of these and many others, but I have selected just a few, most of which are highlighted in your textbook within Chapter 7. So if you want some extra information, by all means, Chapter 7 is a great resource. So just as a reminder, environmental conditions vary considerably throughout the year, for example. Spring and summer has very different environmental conditions than in the winter and the fall. Of course, from day to night, conditions vary as well. And something that we haven't really talked about, but is equally important and a similar type of stressor to animals living in an environment is the presence of water or not. So here is one single site. Animals that live here have to be adapted to live at low tide, so exposed to the air, exposed to the sun, as well as at high tide, right? So when the water is completely covering the land, and of course, not just any water, but salt water. So in general, animals follow one or two main strategies, or sometimes both, depending on the time of year, the time of day. And these two strategies are either conform to your environment or regulate your internal environment, regardless of what is happening in the external environment. And so what we can see here are these two strategies. On the x-axis of both, we see the external environment. So we could be talking about something like temperature, right? So low temperature and then increasing temperature here. On the y-axis, we see the internal environment. So what is going on within the tissues, within the cells of this animal? And so first strategy is conform, right? Whatever is outside is also going to be inside. And so that is what this graph right here is showing us. This is the line of conformity. Essentially, as temperature increases outside the body, it will increase at the same rate and be about the same temperature on the inside of the animal. And so that, again, is the conforming strategy. The other is regulation, right? So you can regulate relatively consistent internal body conditions, regardless of what's going on outside. Right, so for us, we are regulators. As the temperature increases from 0 to 100, maybe, our body temperature doesn't change. It's going to be about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what is going on outside. So we call this homeostasis. And so now and throughout this presentation and in future presentations, you should always be thinking about what is the trade-off here, right? We see these two main strategies. They're not unique in a particular species. They are very common throughout the animal kingdom. And so what is the benefit to each one? And on the other hand, what is the trade-off? Right? What is the disadvantage to following one of these strategies? And so just on the surface here, I would argue that conformists, or these conformers here, are practicing a pretty cheap, as far as energy goes, strategy, right? So it doesn't take much energy, many food resources, doesn't take much food in order to conform to the outside world, but the cost is that activity and growth and healing are all limited. Okay, so it doesn't take much to maintain baseline levels, but you can't do what you want when you want. Regulators, on the other hand, we have to eat a lot, right? We have to eat every day as opposed to something like a lizard, maybe doesn't have to eat every day. So that's just to maintain the baseline activity levels of our body. But what we can do after paying that price is that we can do what we want when we want to, right? Under more conditions, doesn't matter if it's hot or cold, we can do it. So I'm just going to go through a couple different examples of animal adaptations. We'll think about the stressors in the environment, the different variation in the environment, and of course, what animals have evolved to do in order to successfully live in that environment. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is water balance. Okay? As you hopefully remember, water follows salt or follows solutes. And so animals that are living, for example, in the marine environment, so they're living in the ocean, they're living in salt water, their cells are actually hypoosmotic to their surrounding conditions. Okay, so what this means is, just a brief review, is that inside the cells of the animal, so inside the animal, there is a lower salt concentration than there is outside. So the water that the fish is swimming in has more salt than inside the animal. And so if you remember, again, water follows salt. And so this fish, even though it is swimming with water, it's surrounded by water, it will have a tendency to actually lose water, right? So water from inside the cells is going to leave via aquaporins into the outside world. And so fish that live in marine environments would be prone to actually dehydration, again, even though they are surrounded by water. Okay, so there's a couple different strategies here. Some species are osmoconformers, right? That is, they don't change what's going on in their cells. They just kind of let diffusion and osmosis happen and wait for their cells to equalize with the outside world. And that way they aren't becoming dehydrated. They're not losing a ton of salt to the outside world. And so if you look at this list of species, you might notice that these species are the more primitive, right? They evolved a lot longer ago, animals. So tunicates, jellyfish, mollusks, these species, for the most part, don't move very quickly, right? They don't have a very high energy demand. They just kind of hang out and conform to their environment, right? And again, the benefit of that is that they don't need to take a lot of resources in. They don't need a lot, but they can't do what they want when they want to. Many bony fish, on the other hand, are osmoregulators. Okay? So these guys, their enzymes function best at a particular level of salt in their cells. Furthermore, in order to contract muscles, in order to send action potentials, in order to pump the heart and therefore move the blood all throughout the body, which is moving and active at all times, these fish maintain a certain level of salt in their cells. Okay? And again, the cost of that is that that they need to use a lot of energy to do so, okay? And they risk losing a lot of water. And so what they do to be successful in this marine environment is essentially they drink a lot, okay? So if the problem is you're becoming dehydrated because of osmosis, essentially the fish drinks tons of water, okay? And it doesn't pee out a lot of water, right? So essentially it loses very little water via urination, and what urine it does lose is packed with lots of solutes, right? So all the salt water that comes in, they pull the salt out, keep the water, and then release the salt in the urine. Okay. Also, they're able to excrete some of that salt across their gills, right? So more or less getting rid of as much salt as they possibly can. Okay. And right, kind of balancing, counteracting all of that loss of water across their skin. Okay, so that's the bony fish. Some other marine animals have slightly different strategy or slightly different mechanisms, but the strategy is generally the same. So like birds that live on the ocean, sea turtles, marine mammals. So these guys all, again, drink a lot of salt water, but then they excrete the salt through either salt glands or excrete a lot through their kidneys. Cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays actually retain urea, right? So a byproduct of other metabolic functions throughout the body. Instead of peeing that out, right, urea equals urine, they actually hold that in their body tissues so that they are, the cells are actually a higher concentration of salt than the surrounding, or of solutes than the surrounding water, and therefore water comes into their bodies instead of leaving their bodies via osmosis. And so a lot of different strategies, but the same general idea. Okay. Freshwater fish have kind of the opposite problem, right? So they wouldn't get dehydrated, instead they would get overhydrated, right? So freshwater animals, their cells are actually hyperosmotic with the surrounding water. So higher salt inside compared to the outside water. And so as always, water follows the solutes. It would go into the cells. Okay, and so their strategy is that they allow, so the freshwater bony fish are also osmoregulators. Really important for them to keep just the right levels of solutes in their cells so that they can generate resting membrane potentials to fire neurons, contract muscles, do all of the things that they would otherwise do. And so as osmoregulators, they kind of counteract this tendency by essentially peeing a lot, right? So they drink very little water because they're already taking so much water in through their skin. And they urinate a lot with very little salt. So all that salt is going to be saved in their cells so that they can have normal cellular function. And they can even actively take up salt through their gills. So they have little ion pumps in the membranes of their gills, and any salt that is passing by as the water passes over their gills is taken up through these pumps. Okay. All right, so that is water balance in aquatic organisms. Another challenge for all animals, whether you're living on land or in the water, is getting enough of the essential nutrients and oxygen in order to fuel your cells. And so no matter what you are, whether you are a unicellular organism or you are an elephant, all cells need oxygen, all cells need nutrients, and the only way for them to get that is via diffusion, right? So to get nutrients and oxygen from the outside environment into a cell, to a cell membrane, is via diffusion across that membrane. And so if you are a unicellular organism or just a really tiny, smaller bodied animal, you are going to have an easier time getting oxygen and nutrients to your cell or your very few cells than something larger here like an elephant. Right? So in general, smaller bodies have a lower surface area to volume ratio. Okay, so this unicellular organism here has a lot of space on the outside of it compared to inside for exchange of substances. Okay, but as you get larger and larger, cells inside this elephant's head are going to be really far from the surface of the animal, right? Compared to here, right? The mouse surface area to volume ratio is higher, therefore more opportunities to take in nutrients, oxygen from the outside world and feed the tissues. Okay, so size, right, getting larger, becoming more complex, really does pose a fundamental constraint on the evolution of organisms. This was a major evolutionary hurdle to achieve. And so the solution here to a lower surface area to volume ratio as animals get larger and larger is essentially to make more surface. Okay, so as we can see here, And these cnidarians, we have, you know, animals that, you know, get bigger and bigger. And the way that they meet this challenge, they answer this challenge, is by essentially creating more surfaces. Every single one, you know, of these appendages is essentially an interface with the outside world through which oxygen and nutrients may be able to pass. Okay, so this is a much higher surface area and therefore increasing the ability to take in more of these oxygen and nutrients. Okay, another evolutionary jump is essentially bringing that external environment inside the animal. And so this is just a hypothetical organism, kind of like this. And so in addition to increasing surface area, what this animal has evolved to do is kind of, you know, instead of like an organism nice and round, this organism has folded part of its outer surface in, creating a tube. And so now not only is this interface with the external environment on the surface, the outer surface of the animal, but now it is also inside. And so it's bringing the outside world closer to the cells on the inside, and therefore increasing how much of, again, these oxygen and nutrients are being delivered inside the animal. And so this concept just you know, this concept was used, and it is still used in larger and larger animals. We just create even more surface area. And so same kind of thing is going on here. Humans, during our development, have a series of folding events in which we bring tissue from the outside inside the body. And so our respiratory system, for example, has created this tube so that when we inhale through our nose, right, essentially we inhale air from the external environment and we bring it into the body closer to the cells that need the oxygen that is in the air. And we go one step further, we just keep on increasing the surface area, making all of these little bronchial tubes, and at the very end, alveoli. We'll take a look at those soon. Increasing the surface area considerably. So while these more primitive animals increase the surface area on the outside, we have folded all of that inside. And so acquiring oxygen is critically important to all animals, although we do so in slightly different ways, slightly different structural adaptations. And so smallest organisms and the ones that just kind of hang out, they're sessile. These guys are essentially conformers, right? So however much oxygen is in the outside water is how much oxygen is going to be inside these animals. And so if you think about the animals themselves, they're not moving, so they don't need a lot of energy. They don't need a lot of oxygen to make ATP. And they're a lot smaller, right? So they don't have the extra challenges of, you know, a big brain, right? How convenient, but takes a lot of energy. They don't have the challenge of pumping blood, right, all the time, heart contracting, muscles contracting in order to distribute resources throughout the body, because they're so small, all the cells are kind of right next to each other. And so their oxygen demand is very low, and therefore they can get away with conforming to their external environment. So for the most part, they can be successful in a 1% dissolved oxygen environment. That's really all they need. However, most animals, ourselves included, are oxygen regulators. We need a lot more oxygen in our bodies than is in our surrounding environment. And so in order to do so, in order to get more oxygen into our body, we of course need to increase that surface area. And so here are some examples. Here is a scallop. We see these little appendages, all of which are an interface with the outside world and a surface for taking oxygen into the body. Sea stars, the same kind of thing. They have their little respiratory structures sticking up off the surface of their bodies. Okay, so if we zoom in here, all of these little like prickles in between the spines, they're actually gills. And so again, lots of surface area to take oxygen into their tissues. And the nudibranchs went one step farther. Yes, their gills, essentially, their respiratory structures are on the surface of their bodies, just like here in the sea star, but they've jazzed them up to look really pretty, right? Literally, the name nudibranch for these sea slugs is naked. Branch means like bronchial tree, so naked gills, naked respiratory structures. Okay, and so all of these organisms have increased the surface area across which the oxygen can diffuse into the body. Okay, however, what all of these animals have in common is that they're pretty slow, right? They don't really move very quickly. They don't have really high energy demands as a result. Fish, on the other hand, bony fish like this one, have much higher energy needs. And so these guys had to increase the surface area of their gills, of their respiratory structures, even more than the nudibranchs, than the sea stars, etc. But just like in our own lungs, instead of having the gills on the surface, the gills instead, right, these respiratory surfaces have moved into the body. They are protected, super delicate, very nice to protect them inside the body. And so what we can see here in this fish is under the operculum, or the little gill cover, which kind of flaps back and forth, we see a series of gill structures. And so as the fish pulls pulls water into its mouth, it sends that water over this series of filaments in the gills. And so if we zoom in there, we see tons of surface area. Right? More surface area equals more oxygen. And if we zoom in even farther, we see that there is a highly adapted gill structure to maximize the oxygen intake by the fish. Okay, so these are the blood vessels, arteries and veins, right? Blood comes in without much oxygen, and it leaves and goes back to the heart and the rest of the body with lots of oxygen. And so in between the arteries and veins, right, we have these capillary beds, right? So blood is flowing from this artery here across this capillary bed through all these tiny little vessels, picking up oxygen along the way. So that's what the blue to purple to red means. No or little oxygen here, more oxygen, and lots of oxygen over here. And so by the time the blood goes back to the heart, so in this red vein here, it is chock full of oxygen that was just pulled out of the water. And so how exactly does that happen? Well, the blood flows this way, and the water that has just been taken in through the mouth and over the gills, it flows in the opposite direction. And so this is called a countercurrent exchange. And so if we look at this in a diagrammatic way, down here, what we see is that the oxygen poor blood coming from the rest of the body enters the capillary bed over here with very, very little oxygen. But by the time it leaves, it has a ton of oxygen, right, before it goes back to the heart and the rest of the body. Water, we see, is flowing in the opposite direction. When water enters, it has a lot of oxygen, and when it leaves, right, leaves the fish actually, it has much less oxygen. Right, one more detail here to before I put this all together. Note that there is always a difference in oxygen content, oxygen concentration between the water and the blood in such a way that there's always more oxygen in the water than in the blood, regardless of where you look throughout the capillary. And therefore, because substances always follow their gradient, oxygen will diffuse from high oxygen to low oxygen, regardless of where you look in the capillary bed. Right? And so this countercurrent exchange system, it ensures that oxygen is going to diffuse from the water into the blood the entirety of the capillary bed because of this opposite flowing water versus blood. Okay, so lowest oxygen coming in encounters the lowest oxygen going out in the water. And therefore, there is always going to be a difference in which there's more in the water than there is in the blood. And so highly efficient, highly specialized adaptation for acquiring enough oxygen in the aquatic environment to ensure that this fish's cells are fueled with enough oxygen and therefore enough ATP. Okay. Another way that the gills maximize diffusion, in addition to the countercurrent exchange mechanism, is that they use the thinnest possible membrane, okay, the least distance possible between the water and the blood, and thus inside the body. And so the thinner the membrane, the less resistance the oxygen is going to encounter, and so diffusion is going to speed up. In addition to structures like gills, the skin actually forms as a respiratory surface as well in many animals. Okay, so cutaneous gas exchange, so over the skin gas exchange, occurs in many animals. Here we can see that that deoxygenated blood flows into a capillary right beneath the surface of this frog. Oxygen diffuses in, CO2 diffuses out, and so oxygen-rich blood then goes back to the heart and to the rest of the body. And same thing in this worm. Capillary beds are really close to the surface, and therefore, because of the structure of the skin, gases are able to freely cross over those membranes in and out of the blood with their concentration gradients. And so this is really helpful, really beneficial. The animal needs skin regardless. And so why not use this surface for obtaining additional oxygen? Remember that there is plenty of oxygen in the air, so might as well use a bit to increase oxygen in the body. And so this isn't a unique strategy. In fact, if we look at this graph here, what we can see is many different species and how much of their total gas exchange, right, all respiratory structures and the skin, is through the skin. And so we can see here is that cartilaginous fish and bony fish are able to exchange oxygen with the water through their skin. Okay, as animals moved out of the sea, right? So here we see amphibians, a variety of different types of amphibians. It is much more difficult to get oxygen out of the air than it is out of the water. And so these animals started to rely on their skin a lot more in order to obtain more of that, of the oxygen need. Okay, but then, right, as you see, right, evolution continues. Reptiles who have a lot thicker skin, they are going to rely less on cutaneous gas exchange than their amphibian counterparts. And so, again, there is this trade-off here. If the skin is permeable enough, not only can you take oxygen in, but also you are letting water out, right? So just like plants, oxygen in, the water is going to leave. And so that is a major stressor for life on land, right? The biggest stressor of life on land is essentially desiccation, drying out. And so these animals, reptiles, have scales to reduce the amount of water that is lost, but of course that comes at a cost. Everything always comes at a cost. The cost of that is that less oxygen and CO2 are able to diffuse across the skin. And then finally, when you get way up here to mammals, you see that yes, mammals can also practice gas exchange across their skin, but very, very little. Okay, so we see less than 5% of our gas exchange is occurring across our skin. Okay, some animals have additional surface area on the outside, right? Even if they are living in the land, such as these handsome fellas here, we can see these two species must rely heavily on cutaneous gas exchange in order to survive. And we know that because of all of their extra surface area on the surface of the body. Another part of gas exchange that is necessary is that in order for gas exchange to occur, the membrane, right, whatever surface through which exchange is occurring, it must be very thin. Okay, so really thick skin that is great at not letting water to escape is going to be difficult, if not impossible, for oxygen to diffuse through. Also, the skin, the membrane must be wet. And so gas exchange does not occur unless there is at least a thin layer of water through which to diffuse. And that is the case in our lungs as well. And we'll get there here in just a moment. But you need water in order for oxygen diffusion to take place. Okay, so animals with dry skin, such as us, right, as opposed to a salamander who has wetter skin, we do not practice as much cutaneous gas exchange. Okay, again, costs, right? There's always pros and cons here. A frog that has thin, wet skin, and in the case of these guys, also lots and lots of surface area, yes, they can get a lot of gas from the air, which is absolutely a benefit, but the cost of that is that, again, they risk desiccation, they risk drying out, and they risk more injury. Okay, so amphibians in particular are very susceptible to environmental contaminants because not only is oxygen coming in, but any kind of pollutants in the water or in the air can diffuse through the skin as well and harm these animals. And so for the most part, cutaneous gas exchange is not the primary means of acquiring oxygen in the terrestrial environment. Instead, we have moved all of our surface area and the majority of our gas exchange surfaces inside of our body. Okay, and this isn't just vertebrates, it's invertebrates as well. And so here we see a fly, and its respiratory system is, again, inside the animal. It uses something called a tracheal system. The perk to this is that it reduces the amount of water that's lost. Right, so by moving it inside the body, it maintains more humidity and less water loss via breathing. And also, the oxygen is moved closer to the tissues, right? So in this animal, in order to get oxygen all the way to, for example, the digestive tract, which is deep within the fly, these trachea actually deliver oxygen through the side of the fly into the animal and therefore much closer to these major organs, right? So not only reducing water loss, but also helping with the circulation of that oxygen. Okay, lungs. These are very highly adapted, just like gills are, to removing oxygen from the air. And they do this via a very high surface area. Okay, and I'll give you numbers here in just a second. The membrane is very thin. In fact, it's the thinnest membrane that we have in our body. And even though we are, and other lung-breathing organisms are out of the water, we still maintain a thin layer of water on our respiratory surfaces in order to ensure that oxygen can diffuse that water and therefore into our blood. Okay, within our lungs, we have a bronchial tree, so a series of tubes all the way down, increasing surface area, more and more and more and more tubes. All the way at the very end, we have these little bundles. They look like kind of bunches of grapes, but they're hollow inside, and this is ultimately where air is delivered. The membrane itself that is forming these alveoli is as thin as physically possible. Okay, so this here is an alveolus. It is literally 2 cell layers thick one for the alveolus, one for the capillary, which is going around the outside. And so oxygen in the air has very little distance to diffuse to jump into the blood and onto hemoglobin. As opposed to cutaneous gas exchange, where yes, the capillary is super close to that respiratory surface, but it is the skin, of course, has to be relatively thick in order to protect the underlying tissues from any number of environmental stresses. And so diffusion of oxygen from the air into the blood takes a lot longer, right? So it's a lot slower, and therefore less oxygen can diffuse in the first place. Okay, so thin membranes inside the lungs, very high surface area. And again, if we look at this section through an alveolus, again, here is the blood circulating, starts out deoxygenated, then oxygen loads onto hemoglobin and the blood leaves oxygenated. Here, there is a very thin layer of fluid into which oxygen must first dissolve before diffusing into the blood. Okay, so all the things that all of the other respiratory membranes need, we maintain in the lungs, even though we're no longer in the water. Right, so just for some numbers here, humans have 300 to 500 million of these little air-filled spheres called alveoli. Ultimately, the surface area of all of these alveoli adds up to about a half a tennis court in surface area, right? So there's tons of space available for oxygen to enter into our blood. As I said, there are more and more and more tubes in our bronchial tree. And so collectively, we have about 1,500 miles of airways delivering oxygen way down to these alveoli. Right, so tons of surface area, really thin membrane, and maintaining water in order to permit diffusion. All right, next. Animals have advanced ways of not only acquiring oxygen to fuel their cells, but also acquiring nutrients. So acquiring these substrates with which they can build their cells, maintain their cells, replicate, and so on and so forth. A couple different strategies. Of course, herbivores maintain or acquire nutrients from plants. Right? Plants have about a 50 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, and so essentially, animals versus plant molecules are pretty different. Right? Like animal to animal, really not that much different, but plant to animal, very different, right? Very different molecular structures, and therefore herbivores need a lot of cool technology in order to actually get the nutrients out of the plants. For the most part, new plant growth is the easiest to break down for animals, and so a lot of herbivores will take advantage of new plant growth. And in fact, some animals, particularly invertebrates, they actually time their emergence with plant new growth. So for example, in the larval stage, right, they definitely coincide, or the larval stage of this insect is going to coincide with the new growth of this corn and these berries, right? So new plant growth, a lot easier for these animals to work with. Furthermore, there are certain parts of the plant that are always higher in nutrients and a little bit easier for the animals to break down, that is to digest and therefore convert into animal molecules from plant molecules. And the parts of the plant that are the most energy rich are essentially where the plant is growing, and the phloem, so that part of the vascular system of the plant that is transporting glucose or sucrose or other types of sugars. Okay, so this is a woody plant, so this is a tree. If you section through the different layers of the plant, what you see is, the hardwood, this is the oldest, it is usually dead. The sapwood, this is still alive, it's the newest growth. and then the bark all the way on the outside. But between the sapwood, so between the newest tree rings, the layers of the tree, and the bark itself, right, is something called the vascular cambium. And so this is actually the layer at which mitosis is occurring. New cells are being formed right here at this layer. And so the tree selectively sends resources to this area so that the tree can continue to grow. And so that's awesome for the plant. It's also awesome for animals that have figured out that this vascular cambium, and again, also the phloem, are filled with the most nutrients. Okay, so here we see some evidence of beaver. And so beavers aren't just like cutting down trees and like building lodges for the fun of it. They also eat trees. Of course, the wood itself doesn't have much going on. In fact, the middle of it is dead. Right? There's not much that the beaver is going to get out of it. And so here what we can see is the beaver selectively peeled off the bark, and they munched on the vascular cambium underneath it. Here you can see his little tooth marks, selectively getting the best, the most nutrients. Invertebrates do the same thing. This is a gallery, which is essentially the invertebrate burrowing into the wood and into the vascular cambium, creating a little home deep to the bark, but also, as it goes along, munching on all of the goodies within that vascular cambium. Right. So again, animals have lots of different ways of acquiring nutrients, and of course have developed different strategies for finding the best, the easiest to obtain nutrients. Okay. Most of the carbon stored within the plants is in the form of cellulose or starch. Right? And cellulose in particular is a structural molecule making up part of cell walls to give rigidity to the plant. And so most of what herbivores are eating when they're eating plants is cellulose. And so the problem with cellulose is that most animals, most herbivores, don't have the gene to make the enzyme to actually break cellulose down into something they can actually use. All right, so glucose, this monomer here, is what the animal can actually use to build up animal molecules or to fuel cellular function, to make ATP, whatever. But when animals eat the plant, it's getting this big, long, clunky molecule, and it has no way of actually digesting it. Okay, which is kind of a bummer, right? And so how do we have animals that are so big? Like, how do we have an elephant or a rhino or a cow that eats nothing but plants, but it can't actually digest its food? And so the answer there is that these herbivores have a symbiotic relationship with other species, right? Generally microorganisms that are colonizing its gut or different other parts of its digestive system. And these organisms have the enzymes, they have the cellulase enzyme to break this bond and therefore liberate glucose for use by the herbivore. Okay? And so what does that look like? Like, how have the animals evolved to maintain such a critically important symbiotic relationship, like obligate relationship with these organisms? Termites, for example. And so an invertebrate animal has evolved to harbor protists. Right? There's kind of a classic biology lab where you like take these huge termites and you like open up their gut and you like see all the cool protists that come out. Anyway, the protists have a special, the termite's gut is kind of designed as like this nice cushy hotel for harboring these protists. So the protists are comfy there, they have everything they need, and they break down the cellulose with their own cellulase enzymes, feeding the termite, and in exchange they're protected and in kind of the perfect environment for them. Okay. And so it's not just invertebrates. Again, really large herbivores, mammalian herbivores, also have specially modified guts to harbor these invertebrates. And so in animals like horses, again, huge, and all they eat is grass, but they can't actually digest grass. So what they have come to have, if we were to take out the digestive system and lay it all out from end to end, what we would see is, grass is eaten, goes to the stomach, small intestine, and then right at the junction between the large intestine and the small intestine, there is this little weird blind-ended appendage sticking out the side. Right. So what this is essentially where that fiber, that cellulose, is digested. And so this is actually able to hold like 10 gallons of food and water. And it is just chock full with populations of bacteria and other types of microbes, which break down this fiber, this cellulose, for the horse, right? So essentially, like anytime that you change a horse's diet really quickly, and other animals as well, it takes a little while for them to get used to the new food. And the reason for that is that it's not the horse, it's their microbes or their gut flora that, need to acclimate to that new food source. Right. So different species break down different types of plants. Okay. So this is one strategy, a cecal or caudal digester. Another strategy by ruminants, right? So things like cows, things like bison and deer and antelopes. Ruminants have 4 stomachs or 4 chambers of their stomach. One of those, called the rumen, is just like the cecum, chock full of symbiotic bacteria whose sole job is to break down the fiber of the cellulose. Okay, so in this way, herbivores have to eat lots of plants in order to get enough carbon, and that carbon is liberated not by the herbivore's enzymes, but by the microbes' enzymes. Kind of the opposite strategy is animals eating other animals. Okay, so the tissues of herbivores and carnivores are pretty similar, right? So like animal molecules to animal molecules are relatively similar. And so digestion and ultimately absorption of the molecules is really not as complex. It doesn't take as long because there's kind of less work that has to be done because the molecules are so similar. And so in animals, they have like a 10-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, so much closer to what kind of what it should be in the body compared to plants. Right, so ultimately carnivores have to eat less than the herbivores would. Okay? And so there are some adaptations that carnivores have. Once again, if we took out the entire digestive system and laid it out, what we can see first and foremost in this dog, bear, and sheep is that the size of the cecum, for example, is much different, right? So here, this cecum is much larger because this animal is depending on those microbes to break down the cellulose, as opposed to like a dog, right, has a much smaller cecum. Furthermore, dogs, which eat a lot more meat, has a much shorter small intestine for digestion, as opposed to the sheep, right? Much, much, much longer small intestine. Again, animal molecules are similar to animal molecules, and so less digestive activity has to take place. Okay. Also, you see differences in teeth between herbivores and carnivores, and kind of in the middle of those two are the omnivores. So we as omnivores have these kind of flat grinding teeth back here like herbivores for grinding up plants as much as possible. And we also have some carnivorous teeth, right? So like the canines here, these are more similar to canines for piercing and tearing flesh, right? So kind of a spectrum of herbivore to true carnivore. Actually, in reality, dogs and bears are more omnivorous. Cats are more carnivorous. The last topic I want to discuss in this video is how animals exchange energy with their surrounding environment. So essentially talking about temperature regulation. What we see in this image is kind of a simple thermal model of an animal's temperature. What we can see is the surface of the animal, and then deeper and deeper inside the animal. There's always a layer of insulation, so muscle and fat. And the body's core here. Generally, the temperature is going to gradually change from the body's core closer and closer to the surface. In order to maintain this core temperature, right, sometimes warmer than the environment, sometimes cooler than the environment, an animal has to balance these gains and losses of heat through the external environment. And so we'll see animals that change its metabolic rate to generate more or less heat in the body's core. We can see that the amount of muscle and fat, so this L, this insulation layer, ultimately determines how much heat is lost or saved in the body's core. Ultimately, the surface itself is what loses heat through conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation, so things like sweating. Okay? So we're not going to go into detail with all of these different ways of heat loss. What we're going to focus on instead is different strategies. Okay, so kind of two opposite strategies, although as always, it's more of a spectrum. First, poikilotherms, also called heterotherms. These are animals that have a variable body temperature, right? So it's not always 98.6. It varies a little bit. Homeotherms, on the other hand, have a constant or relatively constant, so within a target range, body temperature. Okay, and so I want to point out that poikilotherm and homeotherm is not synonymous with conformers and regulators. Almost all animals are regulating to a certain extent. And so there so all of them are regulating to a certain extent. Very few species are true thermoconformers, and those species live in places that don't have really variable temperatures in the first place. So there's no need to invest energy in changing the body temperature to any large degree. And so not conformers versus regulators. Okay, all of them that we're going to talk about are regulators to an extent. Okay? So animals can sense their environment through a lot of different sensory mechanisms and ultimately regulate their body temperature via behavior. So for example, when it's cold outside, these animals can burrow into the snow or even into the ground where it's nice and insulated, and therefore maintain a relatively consistent body temperature. Okay. Similarly, butterflies, right? If it's too hot, they can move in such a way that they have very little surface area that is exposed to the sun. When it's cold in the beginning or the end of the day, they can turn their wings around, or they turn their whole bodies around, and ultimately have a sail, a big sail of their wings that is taking in a lot more of that solar radiation. And kind of same thing here for this moth, right? So absorbing different amounts of heat depending on whether the animal needs to lose or gain heat. Physiology, so we are going to think about how animals can change their metabolic rate in order to regulate their body temperature. And finally, morphology, right? So different structures that give rise to this ability to regulate body temperature in the first place, right? Other similar terms that that I'm also going to be using are endothermic or endothermy and exothermic or ectothermic, right? So endo means inside, ecto means outside. And so the difference here is that essentially endothermic animals get heat from outside, right? And endothermic get heat from inside. Right? It's generated by changing how quickly chemical reactions are occurring within the body. Poikilotherms are generally ectothermic, right? So these animals generally change their behavior so that they get just the right amount of heat from the environment or lose the right amount of heat from their environment. Okay, so generally poikilotherms are ectothermic. Okay. So an example of ectothermic poikilotherms is a snake, right? So these animals are not able to generate their own body heat on demand, right? So generally are not harnessing this metabolic heat to maintain consistent internal temperatures. Instead, what they do is they actually change their behavior. They move their body to an area that is the right temperature, right? So the right temperature that their body needs to be at. And so this image from your book, what we see here is in yellow, the maximum operative temperature, right? So this is the highest temperature at which this snake can function. In green and boxes down at the bottom, this is the lowest operative temperature. So snake can't function if it's colder than that. And in blue, what we see is the temperature that this snake was over the course of the day. And so we see that even though it's not generating its own body heat as its primary means of thermoregulation, instead, or even though it's not doing that, what we see is that its body temperature is relatively constant and it is well within the range of functionality. And so the way that it does that is it's going to move to different microclimates. Right? So what we can see here is 17, 18 degrees. Out here in the sun, it's really warm, but in the shade of the rocks, it's really cool. And in the ground, also about the same, 17, 18 degrees. Okay, so depending on the time of the day, depending on whether the snake needs to warm up or cool off, it moves to different microclimates in order to facilitate that change. Endothermic animals, on the other hand, so specifically endothermic homeotherms, right? So this means generate their inside heat, right? Endo, inside their metabolism is generating heat. Homeotherms maintaining a consistent internal environment. Endothermic homeotherms, we can use this term to describe birds and mammals. In order to do this, in order to maintain an internal temperature that is relatively constant, that they themselves are generating, they need to have a very high metabolic rate. And so what is a metabolic rate? So this is essentially the rate at which chemical reactions take place in the body. Heat is always produced as a byproduct. And so, ramping up the metabolism is going to produce more heat. Slowing down the metabolism is going to produce less heat. And by, essentially changing this metabolic rate, the animal can change how much heat is kept within the body. And so this graph here is showing us lots of different types of species. On the y-axis is basal metabolic rate, so essentially at rest, just to keep the animal alive and functioning. This is the metabolic rate that was measured. On the x-axis, the independent variable here is the mass of the animal, so smaller animals and larger animals. And so what we can see here is that, first of all, unicellular organisms have a lower metabolic rate, right? Remember that that these unicellular organisms, for the most part, are just conforming, right? They are, their internal conditions are essentially equal to whatever the outside conditions are, and so they don't really need to have a very high metabolism at rest. Okay, as we move to more complex organisms, we see that the basal metabolic rate increases generally. Right, so to keep this fly or this these reptiles, these mammals just existing alive, it's going to take a lot more energy, right? A lot more chemical reactions occurring, just to make sure their neurons are firing, just to make sure their blood is pumping. So those types of things. Okay. Cold-blooded organisms are poikilotherms. So these guys have a variable temperature. Okay, and so they are not generating their own body heat in order to regulate their temperature, and so they don't need to burn through as much fuel to generate more heat. Finally, we get way up here to the mammals. Right? These are homeotherms. Right? They keep a stable temperature. They are endothermic, which means that they get heat from their metabolism, and so they need to ramp up their metabolic rate in order to maintain a constant temperature. Okay, so we can see that there is a cost, of course, of maintaining internal conditions, right? Metabolic rate needs to be higher. The way that you complete more chemical reactions is that you have to eat a lot more food. Okay. The other piece of information that we can glean from this graph is that it is about size, right? So here we see unicellular organisms are the smallest, and way over here we see the largest animals also have the largest metabolic rate, right? And a relatively linear relationship here. And so what we can conclude here is that it takes more energy and more chemical reactions, more juice to keep a larger animal going, even at rest, than it does a smaller organism. Right? And again, this should make sense because there's a lot more that has to happen to keep a larger animal cells coordinated and fed and firing right and all the things that they do. Okay, so larger animals generally higher metabolic rate. Right, so when comparing endothermy, inside heat, with ectothermy, outside heat, as always, there is a trade-off, right? If you compare an amphibian or reptile with a similar sized bird or mammal, what we see is that they only need 10 to 20% of the metabolic rate of these endotherms, right? So you should think of metabolic rate as how much food do they need, right? So amphibians and reptiles need much less than birds and mammals. Okay, so a disadvantage of endothermy is that they require a ton of food, right? Not only food, but also water and oxygen, right? You can't just, hold your breath and go underwater for a while and be okay. Instead, you need to have a continuous supply of these resources. On the other hand, ectotherms, they can endure shortages of food, water, oxygen, right? So they can be underwater for a long time, right? So turtles, burrowing down into the soil under a lake in the wintertime, they don't need to breathe for the entire winter, right? Because they don't have a high basal metabolic rate. They don't need to burn so much fuel just to keep themselves alive. Okay? The costs of ectothermy, for example, are rapid exhaustion, right? They pretty much are only able to have a burst of energy, right? A burst of activity, and then they need to rest for a while. And essentially, that burst of activity is fueled by anaerobic respiration. They don't need oxygen, in order to fuel this, but the cost of that is, it kind of fizzles out really quickly. Okay. As opposed to endotherms, we are able to, if we're trained for it, if we're used to it, we can have sustained high activity, right? People can run marathons. A lizard would never be able to run a marathon. Okay? All right, next disadvantage of ectothermy is that they are pretty much restricted to certain habitats and certain hours of the day. So they physically can't move if it's too cold, right? So if you are, raking leaves or whatever, like do it when it's a little bit cooler because you're less likely to encounter an angry snake that's hiding in the leaves if it's cold, right? So those types of things. We, of course, can be active at any time because our temperature is consistent because of our own metabolic activity. Okay, a couple interesting maybe advantages or at least characteristics of ectotherms. They in general are a little bit longer or smaller in size than endotherms. So you can think about, a skinny little lizard versus a mouse. And so this kind of longer shape is more or less increasing the surface area through which heat can be gained and lost, right? As opposed to the mouse, which has a lower surface area to volume ratio. So essentially it is more insulated. Whatever it is forming, right, whatever heat is being generated inside the mouse stays in the mouse because of its rounder shape. Okay. And finally, ectotherms, right, like lizards, for example, they can live in very sandy deserts, very hot, whereas you don't see nearly as many mammals living in those places. And so the idea here is that when it gets too hot, the reptiles, the snakes, the lizards, can actually burrow down into the sand really deep where it's no longer quite as hot. Right? So again, maintaining these consistent internal temperatures by changing their behavior, by changing the location. If a mammal tried to do the same thing, just burrow down into the sand, it would have much less oxygen, and so mammals can't get nearly as low, and therefore out of the hot upper layer, the upper horizon of the soil, and therefore they might suffocate by burrowing into the sand. Right. So again, ectotherms have this ability to endure shortages of things like oxygen, which can be advantageous. Some animals that live in more extreme environments, hot or cold, have additional adaptations to balance the temperature within the body. So for example, you look at this this duck pond and you think like, oh my gosh, these poor birds, they have their feet in 0-degree water, right? If there's ice on the top, it must be 0 degrees in both the water and the ice. And so 0-degree water, and they're just chilling there all day. Like, how exactly does that work? How do they not get frostbite? Whereas we put our feet in the water for 5 minutes and we have frostbite. So what the heck is going on there? Well, just like the fish, there is a countercurrent exchange mechanism in their feet. And so the way that their vascular system is or has evolved is that warm blood descends in the arteries, right, is distributed throughout the foot, right, feeds all the cells down here in the foot, and the vein, right, deoxygenated blood, ascends back up to the heart right next to the artery. Okay, and so the fact that this is nice and warm blood and this is much cooler blood essentially is going to warm the blood in the foot, right, and warm the blood before it returns back to the heart and kind of shocks the heart. And so again, this countercurrent heat exchange system maintains a level, above freezing temperature within the entire foot, again, because of the close proximity of those two vessels. And so this can be used in the other direction as well. In the desert of Africa, animals can lose more heat, right? They can kind of cool off the blood before it gets into the brain by passing it by the cooled venous blood coming from their snout. Right? So as air passes it, the blood gets a little bit cooler, and therefore the cooler blood picks up some of the heat from the arterial blood before it gets to the brain. Okay. Cetaceans, so whales, porpoises, etc., have another mechanism as well. They have a really thick layer of blubber to make sure that their body heat is conserved. And again, these guys are nice and round, so lots of heat is conserved within the body. Really thick L or insulation layer. But there are also parts of the body, so they're flippers and flukes, that are not insulated, and so heat can be lost out of these structures depending on the needs of the animal at the time. And so far we have talked about a couple different overlapping strategies. Ectothermic, getting heat from the environment; endothermic, getting heat from the metabolism. Also, hetero versus homeothermic, variable temperature versus stable internal temperature. These pairs of terms are essentially at different sides of not a coin, but instead a spectrum. Okay, so some animals can be homeothermic sometimes, but heterothermic at other times. Some animals have ectothermic qualities sometimes in some ways, and then endothermic qualities in other ways. And so again, this is kind of a spectrum. So this slide is titled Something in Between, and we'll talk about something in between ectothermic and endothermic. So before I put up these examples, I just want to kind of compare endothermy to the thermostat in your house. Okay, so the thermostat, right, on the wall, or your phone or whatever at this point, the thermostat does two different things. First of all, it senses the temperature, right? So it is 70 degrees, right? Do we need air conditioning? Do we need heat, right? Like, is this the temperature that is ideal, that has been set to be ideal in the house, right? Is it 30 degrees, right? Is that the temperature that the house is supposed to be at? Okay, so that's one thing that the thermostat does. It senses the temperature and compares it to the ideal set temperature. The other thing that the thermostat does is that it controls the heat, heat and air, right? So it controls the climate, and so it can turn on the heater, turn off the heater, it can turn on the AC, it can turn off the AC, depending on that temperature compared to the ideal temperature. Okay, so there's kind of two different things that are happening there. Again, sensing the temperature and fixing the temperature. Okay, and so there are some animals that can essentially turn on the heat, or we'll say turn on the heat, right? So some animals can turn on the heat, but they don't actually have the thermostat, right? So they can't actually detect what the temperature is in the surroundings, right? So some animals like great white sharks and tuna can actually heat up their bodies to 10, 15 degrees warmer than their surroundings. So they have a heater. And the heater is essentially the deeper muscles in their body naturally heats up their blood. Okay, so here, deeper muscles heating up the blood and therefore keeping the animal a little bit warmer than the surrounding environment. And so in this way, great whites and tuna are essentially endothermic in that they can use their metabolic heat to increase their body temperature. Okay. What they don't have, however, is the thermostat itself, so the detection of what temperature it is. So they can't ramp up their metabolism when it gets cold and slow it down when it gets too hot. Okay, similar kind of thing in leatherback turtles. Again, they had this countercurrent heat exchange to heat up their entire body a little bit warmer than the surrounding environment. Also, leatherback turtles are really big, right? So they have a lot of volume compared to surface area, and therefore there's relatively little heat loss. Okay. And echidnas, they also, these are even more advanced. So echidnas, this little lovely egg-laying mammal from Australia, they do have a heater, right? So they can turn on the heat, but their thermostat isn't really very good, right? So they can sense the heat, like their body temperature, but it's just not that great at connecting the thermostat, the thermometer, to the heater itself. A little bit, but not quite so much, right? So they do maintain an internal body temperature, but the range is very variable because their thermostat's not really that great. Right? And so we can think about these animals as being something in between ectothermic and endothermic. And so a term for this something in between is a mesotherm. These guys they do use a heater, but they generally don't maintain a constant internal temperature. Okay, so they are roughly endothermic, but also poikilothermic or heterothermic. And so let's look at some data here. This is the metabolic rate, okay, and the growth rate. Okay, and so both of these are used to kind of get a pretty good idea of whether you're endothermic or ectothermic. What we see, we'll look up here, fish are solidly ectothermic, okay, and birds, primates, other mammals are solidly endothermic. But again, this is a spectrum. In the middle are animals that can kind of change their metabolic rate, but they can't directly relate that to growth or activity. Okay, so again, there isn't a link between the thermometer and the heater parts of a thermostat. Okay. In our next lesson together, we are going to explore some data from dinosaurs. Of course, we can't measure their metabolic rate directly because they're all extinct, but we can measure other aspects of their bodies and get a pretty good idea of where they stand on this spectrum. Okay, so you might think that they are lizards, essentially, they're reptiles, and so maybe they're ectothermic, but also they're really big, right? So maybe they're endothermic. Like, where are they on the spectrum? Again, these terms are more of a spectrum, and sometimes organisms can be heterothermic at one time, right, and homeothermic at another time, like lots and lots of variability depending on the animal. And so I want to introduce you to this concept of temporal heterothermy, right? So temporal timing, right? So sometimes animals can be hetero or poikilothermic, right? So they have a variable temperature, but then other times, right? Well, sometimes they get heat from the environment and sometimes they get it from their metabolism. Okay, so I'll summarize it that way. For example, insects, we can call ectothermic poikilotherms or heterotherms. When they flap their wings, right, their flight muscles are able to generate a lot of heat, right? So they are able to actually generate heat when it is cold, like really cold, in addition to some other behavioral shifts as well. And so sometimes you'll just see like this moth just like flapping like crazy. This guy is generating heat to warm himself up. That's kind of changing his behavior to maintain an internal condition. And when they're not flying, however, they cool to whatever the ambient temperature is. And so sometimes they're acting kind of like an endotherm, and other times they're acting solidly as an ectotherm. Some animals use, essentially switch more or less to being ectotherms at particular times to save energy, right? Remember that the big benefit to being ectothermic is that it's really not very expensive, right? It's the cheaper strategy of the two. And so if animals need to conserve resources, it's better to be an ectotherm than an endotherm. Okay, so some animals experience torpor. Right, so this is the dropping of the body temperature, essentially cooling more or less to the ambient air temperature for a little bit of time. Right, so torpor is a daily occurrence to save energy. And the next slide, we'll take a look at hibernation, which is much longer. Okay, so for example, diurnal animals like hummingbirds, diurnal meaning during the day, they reduce their body temperature significantly at night in order to conserve resources. Right? So here we see a bird, this is midnight, and so at night we see that the this green line here is the temperature of the body. It decreases dramatically over the course of the night, and then right before the bird wakes up, the body temperature increases again. Right, so this is just being, you know, heterothermic, right, for just part of the day. Okay, in the lab, the conditions were maintained at 5 degrees Celsius, so all of this was on the bird's account. It's not because the lab got any colder. And we can see that the oxygen consumption remained relatively low. And so nocturnal animals, bats, such as bats, they enter torpor during the day, again, to maintain resources. Hibernation. This is the dropping of a body temperature to pretty close to ambient temperature for a long period of time in the winter, or generally during the winter. This is essentially extended torpor, right, for days, weeks, months even. It is a state of controlled hypothermia, and I hope that you enjoy reading about some different ways that hypothermia is maintained in organisms in our reading. The body temperature, right, drops really low. The animal switches some physiological activity. CO2 levels in the blood can increase, therefore decreasing pH. And this is one of the mechanisms for actually maintaining this low temperature, kind of tricking the hypothalamus into being okay with the body temperature being so low and not panicking that it's hypothermic or hypothermic. I do want to mention that bears that are said to hibernate or like be true hibernators are not technically hibernating. Instead, they're just entering kind of a winter sleep. Their body temperature drops by a few degrees, right? Not all the way down to ambient temperature. And they are relatively easily woken up. So if you stumble across a cave with a bear in the wintertime, don't go up and try to get selfies with it, because the bear will almost definitely wake up. And I don't know about you, but when I'm woken up, I'm not terribly pleased with being woken up, and so not advisable to go poke the bear. Furthermore, bears reproduce in the winter time, so they can't be hibernating if they are giving birth and nursing their young. Okay. So anyway, torpor, a short period of lower body temperature during the day. Hibernation is a much longer period, days, weeks, months. And then, of course, there is some other variation, like intense deep sleeping with certain species as well. So with that, I will end this lesson. Thank you guys so much for watching. This little guy is actually hibernating. I look forward to seeing you guys soon and talking more about these different strategies. Thanks so much.